let's say, something happens and the Seattle airport is closed for a day or something like that. That kind of delay can really build up over time. You've got airplanes out of place, you've got passengers who need extra capacity to get out of there, you have flight crews who are in the wrong city. And so if you have two or three of these disruptions stacking on top of each other, it really can bring down a good portion of the aviation system.
You might be traveling for the holidays, and I think a lot of people are thankful that the government shutdown, the longest government shutdown, 43 days, ended on November 13th, because that would have made for a pretty chaotic holiday season. That government shutdown really deeply affected air travel. It was estimated that 5.2 million passengers were affected. On November 9th, which was the peak cancellation day, 2,800 flights were cancelled. And just to put that into perspective, the 2024 daily average was 340 flights cancelled. Flights were backed up and delayed. There was already a shortage of air traffic controllers, so safety concerns in the back of people's minds. At the same time, there were crazy security lines because TSA agents were expected to go to work without pay. Now, a lot of them, as expected and very understandably, didn't go to work. They call this thing the blue flu, where people call in sick because they don't want to go to work unpaid, which is totally fair enough. But it meant the security lines were backed up. At Houston's George Bush Airport, the average security line was 3 to 5 hours before you even get on a flight. Imagine that. Now, like I said, that all ended November 13th, but it made me think, what if something like that happens next summer during the World Cup? We already know this is a World Cup that is going to be heavily reliant on air travel for fans and players getting around the country, following their team. At the best of times, there's already going to be intense security, there's going to be crowds, there will be delays. And as I've touched on before, this is a World Cup that is cross-country. So there will be fans flying from the US to Mexico and back, flying into Canada and back, which means international travel, which means security checkpoints, which means you're going to have to plan accordingly if you want to make your match that you've paid $2,000, $3,000 for. By the way, this is the first podcast I'm doing since the World Cup draw. And if you've been following, you will know that some countries have gotten shafted with the amount of travel they're going to have to put in. Just to shout out a few teams that will be doing a lot of cross-border travel. South Africa, who are playing in the opening game in Mexico City, are going to be traveling from Mexico to Atlanta, back into Mexico for their 3 games. Japan will start in Dallas, then they'll have to go to Mexico, and then back to Dallas. Germany, huge powerhouse, will start in Houston. They'll go all the way to Toronto and then back in the States to New York. And then Croatia, who will start against England in Dallas, will then fly to Toronto and then back to Philly. So again, fans who are following their teams are going to have to make these cross-national air travel trips. So shortly after the government shutdown ended, I spoke to Daryl Campbell, who's a journalist who writes about aviation for The Verge, which is part of the Vox Media network. He spent about 15 years in big tech himself. He worked for Uber and Amazon. And since he's become somewhat of a tech watchdog, he wrote a book called Fatal Abstraction about the threat of the mix of tech and capitalism to our safety, and a tech gone out of control. And so Daryl joined me to talk about, well, what are the worst case scenarios for air travel next summer? What are the pressure points? And even at the best of times, what can travelers do to make sure that traveling by air during the World Cup is not as much of a nightmare as it could be? So here's my interview with Daryl Campbell. Well, Daryl, thanks so much for being here.
Of course, I'm happy to be here and talk about the World Cup.
Do you mind just introducing yourself and telling us a little bit about what you do?
Sure. My name's Daryl Campbell. I'm an aviation safety writer for the tech website The Verge, and I'm also the author of the book Fatal Abstraction.
I've just gotten off a flight, actually. I'm in Charleston, South Carolina. Very, very pleasant experience. No issues at TSA. It seems like things have calmed down since the government shutdown ended. Is that the sense you're getting?
It sounds like it. We had the government shutdown, which was the longest in U.S. history. And really towards the end of it, we had these massive delays, both at the security line and in air traffic control, as people just didn't come into work because they obviously weren't getting paid. I think of the country's about 13 or 14,000 air traffic controllers, for example, only 770 came in every day that they were scheduled. So almost everybody else took some time off. And this was something that just came out because the Secretary of Transportation, Sean Duffy, announced that they were going to be giving those 770 people some bonuses. But I mean, that's just a flavor of the kind of chaos that we've seen in the air traffic system over the last couple of years, that one random event can have these cascading effects that cause delays for days, if not weeks.
When the shutdown was going on, you were following the chaos. Have you seen anything like that before, or was this kind of unprecedented?
We had been looking at, we at The Verge, that is, had been looking at the aviation sector really since the beginning of the year. If you remember, in December and January, there were a bunch of crashes around the world, including a midair collision over Reagan Airport in Washington, D.C. And it was really the first time that I think it really brought it home to people that, for the most part, you can go and fly and not really think twice about it. But there really were these pressures that have built up over the last 10, 20, 30 years that could, in these extreme cases, put people's safety at risk and cause some of these disruptions. And it seems like almost every month since then, there's been something else coming out about travel where there's some safety issue, or there's the possibility of disruption, or, Newark's been the poster child for the US aviation industry, where they just have persistent traffic, staffing, and congestion issues that, if you're flying through there, you can reasonably expect to get delays of an hour, 2 hours, even if everything is quote unquote normal. So it's really just been thinking about, what does this mean about the investment that the US has made in its travel industry, all of the federalized things like air traffic control, like security, like visas and biometrics, in preparation for some of these big events that are going to be come up over the next couple of years. And frankly, the picture is pretty bleak.
Yeah, I mean, how much have you been thinking about air travel during the World Cup? Because, this is an expanded tournament, right? It's 48 teams. It's all over, not just the US, but also cross-border, right? Canada and Mexico. Fans and players are going to be traveling a lot. Does the system as it is seem like it can handle that kind of magnitude of travel?
Let me frame it in the context of kind of where the system is at today. So, if you look back to the Qatar World Cup, about 1 million people flew internationally to Qatar. And that's partially due to obviously the smaller team set, but also just because it's a Middle Eastern country away from some of the big quote unquote power centers of international soccer, South America and North America. For the US, Canada, Mexico World Cup, the State Department is expecting 6 million visitors to come into the United States. That is essentially like an extra month of travel demand compressed into the several weeks of the World Cup. So in an average month, the US welcomes in between 5 and 6 million international visitors. And during the summer, that obviously peaks a little bit more. So just imagine you're essentially doubling the volume of the number of people that want to come in the busiest time of the year. And I think that'll give you a flavor for how things may go wrong at pretty much every turn. We've already seen under the current demand levels for international visas, these massive delays in processing. We've seen this kind of arbitrary enforcement of rules at the border, at airports. And there's just a lot of uncertainty about the US's number one, capacity to process all of these people that are coming in. And number two, the desire to make them have a relatively pleasant experience. For a lot of people who haven't been to the US in the last couple of years, they may find their first experience coming off the airplane to be quite a bit more unpleasant than it was pre-pandemic or 10 years ago.
And it was already pretty unpleasant.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's something that a lot of Americans don't necessarily understand. That if let's say you're enrolled in global entry, you can walk off the plane, you get your photo taken, you go through this line in 2 minutes. The average standard customs process for an international traveler, assuming there's no line, can be 10, 20, 30 minutes. And it can involve this really kind of thorough questionnaire. You can be detained for essentially arbitrary reasons. And there's an element of risk when it comes to just trying to go to something that you think is going to be fun and enjoyable, especially for some of these countries where the US doesn't have the best relations. The other thing is, FIFA has a list of some of the top traveling countries, in other words, the people who travel the most from certain countries, and some of the big ones like Brazil, Argentina, Mexico don't have visa waiver programs. So everybody who's trying to come in is going to have to go through the hassle of getting an appointment at a consulate, waiting through the wait list, going in person to have this thorough background check, and then waiting for the visa processing. So, if you're buying your ticket and expecting that in 2 weeks you can get a visa done, I think some people are going to have a rude awakening and may not be able to take advantage of the World Cup.
Yeah, I mean, you made a great point that a lot of Americans might not realize what it's like turning up as an international traveler at an airport, at customs, that even if you have a visa and you have an approved visa, that's not the end of the story, right? It's kind of at the discretion of whatever officer you see as to, I suppose, how they're feeling that day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wrote a piece on the TSA for The Verge a couple of years ago, and one of my interviewees is a guy named Rami Ismail. He's a Dutch-Egyptian game developer based in Amsterdam, and when he was traveling extensively to the US, he was married to an American, and he contrasted the way that she went through customs versus the way that he did. For her, it was a 2-minute process. He had multiple instances where he was detained, questioned, taken off to another room, and even one that he talked about where she made a joke and he suffered the consequences by getting led away for questioning for several minutes. So there's this sort of intake system. There's this kind of disconnect between the visa part and the security part. They're run by different agencies. Each one has different standards, and they don't really talk to each other. So even if you have a very easy visa process, that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to have an easy security process on the other end.
And the other thing is, you might not just be entering the US once for the World Cup. You might be entering multiple times because, like we said, this is a multi-country tournament. So just looking at the schedule, there will be some groups where, a team is going to be here and then in Mexico and then here again, or vice versa with Canada. Should fans, I suppose, factor in delays each time they're crossing the border? Do you foresee that being an issue?
Would never tell anyone that you can get to the airport too early, especially these days, especially if you're on a B1 or B2 visa. So this is the one that isn't part of the ESTA waiver system. Build in some extra time for scrutiny. Just to give you an example of what that actually means, the people who are checking visas at the airport, so Customs and Border Protection, there's about 33 to 35,000 of them working today. And that's about 20% below what the US thinks is the right staffing level just for today's volume of traffic. So if you think about the fact that during the World Cup, there's going to be at least twice the volume with a force that's already, 20% below target, I think that creates a real risk that you're just going to see these massive bottlenecks within the airport. And I think that's also exacerbated just by airline schedules. Anybody who's lived near a major airport knows that they always compress all the big international flights during a specific part of the day just for efficiency purposes. So, if you've got a fully loaded 777 from Qatar and another one from Abu Dhabi and another one from London, that's 1,200 people that you have to process, and that's going to be a huge amount of delay. So I would say that build in an extra 1 or 2 hours at the very least if you're on a B1 or B2 visa for sure.
I won't hold you responsible for anyone's kind of travel plans, but if people are thinking about, well, maybe I should just drive from Boston to Toronto or New York to Toronto, whatever, Seattle to Vancouver, do you know much about what the land borders are like versus the air borders?
The land borders, it really depends. So I think for Canada, that would be less of an issue, although I'm not 100% sure that, for example, if you're renting a car in the US, that you can even take it across the border. For Mexico, I would advise people to either take a bus or walk across the border and get an Uber or a cab or a bus on the other side. The border crossings, especially in Mexico, where they've been just high scrutiny for decades, agents have the power to quite literally dismantle your car if they have a reasonable suspicion that you're smuggling drugs through or doing something illegal. So the laws that protect you inside the US are not the same as the ones that are in force when you're at the border crossing. And I think that gives security and CBP a lot more authority and less oversight as to, what they're quote unquote allowed to do. So I would say driving to Canada is probably just going to be a pain for rental purposes, but I really wouldn't advise anybody to go through Mexico.
Okay, yeah. I suppose factoring out any international travel. What about the domestic picture? I mean, if you're flying cross country for different games, and even for example, the US team I think has their first game in LA and then they're kind of up in Seattle, right? So if you're following your team around, again, can you expect delays domestically? Not a lot of people have fond things to say about traveling these days, but I just remember it being a lot easier. I mean, are things slower these days? Are there more delays? And is this going to exacerbate it?
I think the good thing about the World Cup timing is that it happens in summer where there's a relatively smaller amount of weather delays, and a lot of the stadiums are in sort of the Sun Belt or places where you might get clouds and rain, but you wouldn't necessarily have these, big thunderstorms or anything like that. So I think the airlines have a good model for how to manage this kind of demand, and it's really broadly similar to what you would see during, World Series or the NFL playoffs or other big, tight, compressed sporting events, just on a much larger scale. So I doubt that airlines are under capacity in terms of where they're scheduling flights. I think the big thing that we saw this year was that if there's just one hiccup, like let's say you interviewed a security professional in one of your first podcasts for this series, and they were
Mhm.
talking about the potential threat in an airport. So let's say, something happens and the Seattle airport is closed for a day or something like that. That kind of delay can really build up over time. You've got airplanes out of place, you've got passengers who need extra capacity to get out of there, you have flight crews who are in the wrong city. And so if you have two or three of these disruptions stacking on top of each other, it really can bring down a good portion of the aviation system. So I think it'll depend on weather, on security, on planning, but these are all very hard things to predict. So I think the airlines are doing the best they can. It's just a fact of life that the US is not built around a high-speed rail system, and all of these major cities are pretty far away from each other. If you compare it to going to Qatar, you just hop on the rail and you're in another stadium in 20, 30, 40 minutes. Here you've got, LA to New York is going to be a 4.5, 5 hour flight, multiple thousands of miles distances. So I just think there's kind of this natural spread out sort of geographic element that you don't necessarily have in some other ones. I mean, even looking ahead to future European-based soccer championships, even if it's in, let's say, Germany, Belgium, France, Italy, you've got high-speed rail networks, you've got borderless travel, so it's just going to be sort of foundationally a lot easier to move around.
Yeah, I think the next Euros are in like the UK. So, I mean, that's just so much more manageable right now. The US is sort of its unique kind of thing, I suppose. I remember someone at Qatar like going to every single game. And I suppose that is doable if you want to, kill yourself doing
Yeah.
it. But in the US, I guess you're just going to have to live with the fact that that kind of thing's just not going to be possible. And that leads me to kind of pricing as well. I mean, people are going to have to think about how much these flights are going to be. Do airlines now work under this dynamic pricing model that FIFA is also using for their tickets? Are people going to be expecting to pay more when the demand's high next summer?
I would have to believe that the answer is yes. I mean, airlines are really the first pioneers of dynamic pricing, and they know that this is generally going to be a more affluent traveler base. They have to go where they have to go at a specific time, so they don't really have a ton of pricing power. An interesting thing that I think may happen is you've got your mainline airlines, so American, Delta, United, that are probably going to take the bulk of the domestic travel market. And I think they're really going to be sort of price focused and sort of trying to protect their margins. It would be interesting to see if someone like a Southwest or a Frontier does a sort of undercutting campaign where they get you to some place that's not quite there, like Burbank instead of LA or Oakland instead of San Jose. But if you can navigate the kind of on the ground aspect of it, you may be able to find some pretty good deals. And that's really what they're known for. So it's definitely not the case that you can't find a good deal. But I think for the carriers that get you, right there at a time that's appropriate, I think that one you're going to have to expect to pay a little bit more for.
Do airlines tend to increase their flights, increase their routes during these big events?
Yeah, really the only thing preventing them from adding capacity is just the number of landings and gate slots, which is kind of going back to what we were talking about earlier, is that if everything goes smoothly, then they should be able to add plenty of capacity to get people to the matches in time. But if something starts to break down, whether it's air traffic control or weather, then you create this huge buildup of people needing to get somewhere where you may not be able to see some of these matches in time, or you may get routed to a weird other destination because there's some failure of the system. So the The planning process is partially scientific and partially keeping your fingers crossed that everything goes according to plan. They have, very fairly sophisticated recovery models, but when you've got double the capacity, those break down pretty quickly because it's already an extraordinary event, and now you're trying to layer on an extra level of complexity.
You mentioned there was a couple of high profile crashes a little while ago, and there were reports that during the kind of Doge era that the Trump administration was trying to cut back on air traffic controllers, and some were saying that's not accurate. What's the kind of truth there? I mean, are things safe right now? Are there enough air traffic controllers?
Well, there aren't enough air traffic controllers, but what the system does when it has these capacity constraints is really just slow things down. So we saw this during the government shutdown when places like Newark were adding on 2 or 3 hour delays just because they didn't have enough people to dispatch airplanes safely. So I would say there's no additional security risk or safety risk, I should say, but there is a higher chance that you might see some delays or some, non-standard routings. And specifically to your question about did Doge lay off air traffic controllers, the answer is sort of in a very narrow sense, no. However, air traffic controllers have been saying for decades that they need better maintenance, upgraded equipment, and in some cases, just the funds to get their radar and satellite tracking systems into a serviceable state. And what Doge did lay off were a lot of these airport maintenance workers who, by the very narrow definition of flight critical safety personnel, no, they weren't, but they're the ones who are, making sure the cables are working and making sure that a facility doesn't have a water leak on a major electronics server. So those people did have a couple hundred layoffs, and it's already a pretty lean organization. So if there aren't the same investments or like additional funds to make up for the fact that you were going several months without these maintenance workers coming in, I do think there's this high risk of another sort of Newark style radar outage happening, down the road. Now, again, I don't think that it's ever going to cause a safety risk because pilots, air traffic controllers have learned to understand the limitations of the current system, but the risk is always going to be more on the side of delays, diversions, and not getting you where you think you're going at the time that you think you're going to get there.
When I reached out to you, obviously it was a couple of weeks ago when all this stuff was happening with the shutdown, and I was trying to think, what if this happens next summer? I know you can't predict what's going to happen with this government, but these things seem to be happening more frequently these days. If something like that happened during the World Cup next summer, I mean, is that just going to be absolute chaos? Is it just like avoided at all costs at that point?
I do think that there's a strong economic incentive not to make that happen. And if you look at the timing of some of these previous shutdowns, they've all been in the October, November timeframe. So I think from a shutdown perspective, there's probably a low risk of that. Now, that being said, we hear all the time about potential deployments of additional border patrol or ICE or other federal agencies that are staffing up during some of these big events. And if you see that, you imagine a world, for example, where you have an ICE detachment at some of these airports. That's a completely different element of chaos that may come through where we just can't predict how it's going to be. So you would think if this was a rational administration that they would do everything they can to make it as smooth as possible, but I wouldn't bet money on it. And there's always this angle of how can we create leverage for the administration over immigration policy, over economic concessions. Who knows what the topic of the year might be during June, July 2026. I've been covering this for a while now, and I have not seen this much chaos and instability, or at least the potential for it, really since post September 11, that nobody really knew how the aviation system was going to operate. So I guess my advice to people would be build in a lot of extra time, build in flexibility, and to the extent that you can, make sure that the administrative state has no reason to sort of linger on you, that all your paperwork is in order. And that's probably going to be your best bet for having as smooth an experience as possible. But it feels very weird and confusing to try and say that when, for my whole life, it's really been the land of the free. People take this right to travel for granted. And now we're seeing that this idea is falling apart right before our eyes before one of the biggest international travel periods in, I think, the US's history.
Yeah, and to add to that, Americans tend to travel in the summer, right, for vacation, which, I'm from the UK and people tend to travel throughout the year when it's cold. They want to get away. But I suppose a lot of Americans go to their kind of vacation homes and that kind of thing.
Yeah, summer is by far the biggest leisure travel period of the year. So I think layering that on top of the World Cup is going to mean a lot of people going through airports.
Great. Well, Daryl, any final thoughts or final tips? Any kind of, just hang in theirs or anything like that?
I don't want to bore people with the details of security policy and visa restrictions. So I think we covered the big highlights.
Well, Daryl, thanks so much for taking the time. I know it's a busy time for you, so I really appreciate it.
Sure, no problem, Talib.